Hi there and welcome to another edition of Ask Lex, where we talk to learning experts who can help answer questions to take your practice forward. And today I'm talking with Josh Humphries, who is the CEO and founder of Guroo Producer. Welcome to the hot seat, Josh.
Thanks, Karen. Nice to be here.
So we first met at a meetup a little while ago where you were presenting on xAPI. So I went there because I didn't really understand how it all worked, and you helped me understand that. But there's lots of chat about xAPI and data in our industry at the moment, and I find a lot of it a little bit techie and kind of over my head and confusing, to be honest. But we've been talking a little bit more about the actual use of xAPI and the kind of activities that it can drive within an organisation. So we thought we would put together and ask Lex and pick Josh's brains to help us all understand what we can do with it. We're going to break this down into a couple of areas. We're going to focus on that our L&D audience can relate to and explain how xAPI can transform the way they work. So we're really looking at the practical here. So Josh, many people are already personalising their learner experiences with existing approaches like branching and scenarios, that kind of personalisation. When you're dealing with data and using xAPI to get that data out, we're talking more about learner journeys. So I think most people understand what that is at a high level. We're going to dive into that a bit more in the next video, but could you just give us an idea of how learner journeys can be different and more powerful using xAPI?
Sure. As you said, xAPI can be a bit techy, and it's a shame they gave it such a technical name because of the barrier to engaging with it. But fundamentally, at its core, it's just a way of collecting, analysing, and using data about learning. And so therefore, that means that if you can use data in a learning journey, you can personalise that journey based on the data that you've collected. So it's a little different to things like branching scenarios, where it's really if I answer this, then show that. Whereas when we use data, we can actually turn on and off bits of content or change the direction in which someone is going through their journey by actually understanding some information about them. So it's a bit more powerful. It's a bit like measuring the capability that people have, and then we can therefore then adjust the way forward. So we talk about using data in, I guess, 4 different ways when we look at learning journeys. The first one is within the learning that we're at, the learning journey itself that we're delivering.
Okay.
So in that particular example, so say a branching scenario, you actually have to design all these different pathways that someone might go through a piece of learning. Whereas the approach that we take is to measure people's capabilities against a series of indicators in that learning and then adjust the pathway based on how they're performing. So to give you a concrete example, if we were building a piece of learning about a customer service scenario, we might be measuring things like empathy, process, or product knowledge based on the different actions or answers someone gives throughout a piece of learning. In that particular situation, we have all these little indicators in the background that are tracking how you're performing against those, and then we personalise based on how you're doing in terms of that assessment. So it's a little different, and to be honest, somewhat easier to implement because we all talk about learning objectives and capabilities. What we need to come up with is just ways of measuring those, and then once we measure those, we can turn content on and off. Whereas with a branching scenario, you immediately get to so many different permutations and combinations it does your head in. And
it gets very expensive and time consuming to produce.
It is. So in this particular case, it's less about multiple paths and more about getting an assessment of someone's capability and then giving them the content that is required to fill a gap, or in some cases it might be a self-assessment that's around strengthening one of their strengths. It doesn't always have to be about filling gaps. Sometimes we can get an indication of what people are good at and give them more of that so that they can develop further in that area. And we see that a lot in leadership training. It's not always about gap filling, and I think that's the other important distinction when designing learning experiences for more senior people. It's not always about making people better. Sometimes we can actually help them fulfill certain goals that they have.
Yeah. And it sounds like as well with that kind of responsiveness, that those sort of things could be happening in real time within the learning experience. So we don't have to wait until the end to assess how somebody did and then go back and, you know, help them fill in those gaps. You can take them on a path. If we see we're not doing so well somewhere here, we can give them more of that or something similar that's going to help kind of fix that problem before we get to the end of the, you know.
Exactly. And so one of the things that we find is that using xAPI, what is traditionally like looks like an e-learning module, we can create that responsiveness within the experience, which makes it less disjointed. You're not going in and out of all sorts of different applications or different types of content. To the learner, it's seamless, and that obviously reduces the barriers that might be there for them to engage, and it doesn't create opportunities for them to leave as they transition from one piece of content to another. We can create quite a smooth experience. So that's within the experience itself, but we also have the opportunity with xAPI to bring in data from other previous learning experiences.
Okay.
For example, if I performed in a certain way on a previous learning experience, whether that be digital, whether it be some form of competency check someone did on me, etc., we can then personalize the learning experience that I'm in now based on how I performed or what data you might know about me from a previous experience. Because xAPI, unlike SCORM, lets you read data from the entire profile that you have about a person, as opposed to SCORM only lets you have access to the data of that experience that you're currently in. It doesn't let you query other information you have about people. So that obviously means that we can progressively personalize things throughout a much longer journey that might go for weeks or months as opposed to for 20 or 30 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
So which is really obviously handy.
Very handy. So I think, so taking the parts of the learning experience, what about embedding learning in the workplace? How does that?
So well, one of the things that we found when we started playing with xAPI is that we could start to merge together some of the more traditional materials that you might give out to do this, like workbooks and journals and action plans and blueprints and all of those. We could embed those in the actual flow of the learning experience, because once we had xAPI, we weren't limited to the data that we could collect from someone. So we could start to create different kinds of questions in the learning experience that were around how are they going to embed it in practice. So short response questions, reflective questions around, well, you've just learned this thing, now what are you going to do with it? How are you going to apply it to your workplace? And we could do that all in the flow of what was before a e-learning module. But we decided to make it a bit clearer that it was more than a piece of e-learning, because it's not really about compliance or content, but it was about working. We renamed it to a digital workbook. Yep. Same technology, but the idea is that it guides the entire journey of that particular learning experience. So it might be like an e-learning module that stays with you for a month because you're going through a process of embedding what you have, knowledge you have into the workplace. So you identify an action and we capture that. The other good thing about xAPI is as you capture that data, you can give it back to people in different formats. So at the end of the learning experience, we can collate together the answers that someone gave to a series of selected questions and present back to them an action plan. So these are the actions that you said you would take back at work about this piece of learning that you've given to. But even more powerfully, we can collate them together and give them to their manager or facilitator or coach or whoever it might be that's going to help them embed it in the workplace. So I guess the term that we use when we talk about that kind of learning is working in the flow of learning. So you're asking them to immediately, having learnt about something, to think about how am I going to apply this and capture that action that they're going to take and find a way of keeping them accountable to taking that action by using that data in an intelligent way.
Yeah, I was just going to say actually that accountability is the key thing, isn't it? Because ultimately we want our learners to be more responsible for for their own learning journeys and their own learning pathways, and having that kind of feedback from a learning experience, I think it will help with that. Because it's a lot better than just taking your own notes or not taking your own notes, or remembering or not remembering. It's kind of like here's what you said that you would go back and implement, and there's the plan to do it.
Yeah, and accountability comes through in giving it back to them at the right point. So I've identified these things, now I'm at the end. Here is what you said you were going to do. one of the advantages of that is we lower, again, one of the barriers to engagement. There's nothing worse than when you get to the end of a piece of e-learning and it says, now go and develop your 6-point action plan. You're like, okay, I'm going to shut that down now and I'm just going to move on with the rest of my day. But if we can ask them those questions as they go, they're obviously progressively doing it. And then at the end, we actually present them back something of value. We're actually saying, here you go, here's all the things that you said you were going to do. And so it's a benefit to them as opposed to a barrier. But we can also use managers, which I said, but you can also use xAPI to create some form of social obligation as well. So if you're in a team-based situation, we can give back the actions of the team to the rest of the team that were identified, because xAPI lets you collate the data of an identified team as well. So if different people are doing the same experience, we can say, here's your team action plan, and give it back to them as well. So we can also create what I call structured social activities. It's more than just a discussion board, but if we're asking everyone the same question, then we can give the answers back to the people that also need to see it, not just the person who answered it. So, you know, it's a bit more structured than go and type into Yammer what you said you were going to do. We can provide it back in the form of a plan and reformat it as well, which is cool.
So just going back, we've already sort of mentioned earlier on about branching and feedback with relation to e-learning, because I think a lot of people watching will be of that mindset. They maybe use, like me, lots of branching in Captivate and stuff like writing different scenarios. xAPI allows us to take that to another level. So, you know, rather than spending hours on storyboards figuring out different responses and scenarios to personalise learning, that's often directed a lot of the time. That how much of that you can do in a project is usually defined by time frame and budget of the project. Now, and I've found sometimes when we've developed different project solutions that we've been inhibited by time frame and budget. So it's like, you know, we would love to do this amazing thing that we know would have some effect, but you know, the project doesn't allow for it. How does using xAPI and that data kind of framework help get those solutions out quicker?
Yeah, and I think trying to use xAPI in the existing toolkit that people have can be very expensive because of the way that you have to do it like a developer. So, you know, tools like Articulate and Captivate were meant to replace developers and let you produce things fast. But when it comes to things like xAPI, you end up having to go into a bit of a console somewhere and type all this code and try and understand it. And it gets really expensive, really complex, and very unreliable because it's very easy to get yourself into a mess. And, you know, you can't just be a learning designer to use it. So what we tried to do is, I guess, design an xAPI first authoring tool that implements those kinds of learning models that I just talked about. And so what we did was build a whole bunch of, I guess, templates or interactions that are built around xAPI and that just track in the way that it's expected to track. So on the surface, as a learning designer, you have no idea that there's any xAPI happening underneath it. What it is you put in a learning objective that you're going to measure. And then by answering a set of questions, you map those questions back to a learning objective. And then at the end, it says if this person hasn't reached this benchmark on this learning objective, you can display this piece of content. So it uses, I guess, models or thinking that a learning designer would be familiar with in order to create that personalization. And we bake that into the engine that we use to create xAPI content. To be honest, I don't think that you could do it any other way, in a way that would let you be fast and affordable. If you tried to build from the ground up an xAPI solution every time, it just would be cost prohibitive, and that's one of the reasons we do what we do. I tried to build one of these in one of those other tools when we first started out, and on a plane trip from Sydney to Singapore, I managed to build myself one screen. And it's just too hard. You need to, for it to be reliable, it needs to be baked into some repeatable patterns and some repeatable screens and a learning approach as opposed to a techie approach, like we said at the beginning. That's the problem we're trying to solve, is make xAPI useful to learning designers. as opposed to developers only.
And learning designers will love you for it. So presumably, because we're able to give better feedback and be more responsive through that learning journey, and tracking all the data that goes with that, how does that translate into metrics and measurement that we can use for performance coaching and ROI? Because we still like that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as I mentioned in the previous response, we kind of, we let you set up a whole bunch of metrics that are related to your learning objectives or the outcome. We track those back to the learning record system, and we can give you an indication of how people are performing on it. So, for example, in the example I gave you around the sales scenarios, we can give you a measure of how a person performed on empathy, process, and product skills, and from a knowledge perspective. We can also start to record things beyond knowledge though. So for example, in a recent project that we worked on, we had actually 7 of those indicators that we were measuring knowledge on. But we also put a whole bunch of questions around the confidence to actually execute on those areas in the workplace.
Yeah.
We baked into the learning experience questions around knowledge and confidence pre and post the learning experience, so that we could see how far we'd moved the indicator. So we were able to do pre and post assessment, but not in your typical way where it was a survey or a quiz. It was actually embedded into the whole learning experience, so the learner doesn't know that they're actually being continuously measured. It's just wherever a question pops up, I answer it, I get some feedback. But because xAPI is much more sophisticated than SCORM, where you can only track one score, we're able to track a whole bunch of different scores so that we can actually measure the effectiveness of our learning from, in that case, knowledge and confidence. Okay. But I think the next level, if we talk about the working in the flow of learning that I mentioned, where people can capture actions, we can, in that same project, what we did is take those 5, each person had to actually give 5 actions they were going to take back in the workplace from the learning program that they've been through. We were able to put together that action plan. We were able to give it to them and their manager to keep them accountable. Okay. But we then created an xAPI-based dashboard, which is nothing but a piece of HTML, like a learning module, but we give it to the manager. They could then go in and actually rate how that person had performed on those actions a month later. So they were looking at what the business impact of that action was, and they gave them a rating out of 5. And that rating was a combination of how effectively it was executed and how much impact that action had on the actual business. Mm-hmm. So there was actually 1,200 people in that program. And if there's 5 actions per person, that's 6,000 actions that were immediately implemented across the business within a month and measured as to what their business impact was on the business. Now that's very powerful in terms of seeing an immediate return on investment of your learning programs. We could also go and look at things using xAPI, like, did that lead to improved sales? Did it lead to, a safer work environment? And they would all be very interesting things, but they're very hard to measure, because even though technically you can do it, you've got to get the data from other parts of the business. But you don't know whether or not your learning program is really having the direct impact.
Directly responsible for that, yeah.
So what we advocate for is designing a way of measuring business impact, where what we do is we take those actions and we actually ask the manager or colleagues or whoever it might be to actually give feedback as to what the impact of the actions people take on a learning program are on the business. And that helps you, A, isolate your impact, B, helps you get to an immediate measure within a month or 2, or depending on how long that you expect people to take to embed their learning into practice. Mm-hmm. You get feedback really, really soon, and you have some control over the way that you're measuring the return on investment of your learning programs.
Okay, that's cool. And obviously, like with all of these things, that you need to be thinking about that at the outset of designing that learning experience when you're looking at that learner journey. It's like, what do we want to know? So rather than just, did they watch all of that video and did they click that thing and did they all pick, the right response in that scenario? if we are going to implement learning in this business, how do we want it to impact the business, whether that's the bottom line or whether that's behaviour, and understand that at the beginning so that you can get that data out, because it's, you know, what you get in is what you get out.
Absolutely. I mean, the way that we design that program, and I design any program where I get to play with lots of xAPI data, is to design two things first. The dashboard that I'm going to give the sponsor to show the impact of this, its live data and the impact of their program. But the most important thing that I design is the collated artifact that the person is going to get at the end of the experience to implement. So for example, in this particular case, it was a 5-part action plan. In some of the leadership things, we do things like leadership blueprints. It might be, if you were doing a learning program on marketing, it might be a marketing plan. But always design the artifact and then figure out how we design a learning experience that lets the learner progressively build that artifact throughout the learning experience. Because you've got to start with the end in mind. If you start with, it's fundamentals of problem or experiential based learning. If you start with the thing that you want them to be able to do or create or implement, and then figure out what learning they need to actually create that thing, and then embed into that learning flow a bunch of questions or activities that you want them to do to help them progressively build up that artifact. It actually is a relatively easy thing to do if you start with the end in mind, but I think we have sometimes a habit as learning designers of starting with the knowledge instead of the thing that of the thing that we want them to create and the actions we want them to put in place.
Yeah, and that's all part of that mindset shift, isn't it? Even going from being the order taker to the performance partner. You know, right, when somebody says like we need a course on this, we don't say yes, we say why, and then we work out why, and then we can design a solution. So
it really is. I saw someone explain it as a funnel the other day to me, and it showed me that where our thinking goes wrong, and that was we're going to have a look at a bit of knowledge, and then we're going to test whether you have that knowledge, and then we're going to ask you to do something with it. And it's like, but everyone drops off by the time we get to the bottom of the funnel, which is but if you think about it the other way and start with the thing that you want people to create, and then just pack on the learning around that thing, it becomes much more engaging for the learner because they're working towards an artifact that they actually get to create and put into place in their day-to-day role.
Yeah, Josh is very kindly offered to share with us some resources that I'll put links to below the video around some case studies and overviews of xAPI that they have for us. But also you can get hold of a little tool they've created to assess your readiness for data-driven learning. So how ready are you to take this next step into the learner sphere? I don't know what we want to call it, but just using technology and thinking a bit differently about how we create those learning experiences. So you can do a little bit of a self-assessment there and see where you're at. So thanks very much for your time, Josh.
No problem, and I look forward to talking to you next time.